Well, a very warm welcome to all our viewers. My name is Orr-Ewing. I'm the founder of Keystone Tutors. And today I'm here with Ed Richardson, our Director of Education. And today we're going to be talking about interviews to independent schools in the UK. Please do ask any questions. You can put them in the comments section and we will do our best to answer them live. If you are coming to this later on, again, just please put a comment and we will get back to you after this talk has been recorded. Now, Ed, you have done hundreds, if not thousands, of interviews with 9, 10, 11, 12-year-olds. Could we maybe start by asking, how important are they?
I think they're really important for different reasons, but centrally it's about two things. One is to give context to the school around the academic results from the tests that will have been sat as a part of the assessment. And the second reason is about character, getting a sense of the student's personality as well as the other things that they can offer within school life. And I think that's really important, particularly within boarding schools, where that kind of extracurricular, but also the sense of capability to board needs to come across.
So they're more important for boarding schools than for day schools? Does that mean they're not important for day schools?
No, not at all. I think they're kind of 1/3 of the process, which is sort of an assessment is often a part of an admissions process, the interview and then the reference. And I think they've got equal share, I would argue, and that they're very important, an important part of it. And I certainly think that for some students, the interview can really elevate their position, particularly after a set of tests, if they haven't gone as well.
So you can kind of win it on the interview. Can you lose it on an interview too, do you think?
I think that's a little bit more challenging to lose it on the interview, but I do think it is possible. I think if you have somebody who is sort of comfortably over the line in terms of what a school is looking for academically, but really delivers a sort of monosyllabic, uninterested interview, then I think it might start to raise some questions about the suitability of that character for the school. And obviously, if it's a boarding school, that may even raise a few more questions as well.
Do you think that's particularly we often hear this culture that schools are worried that children have been over-tutored, that maybe they look to the interview to see the real candidate, the real strength. So if someone has put in a good performance academically, but then really under-delivers in the interview, that could be a big problem?
Definitely. I think that's absolutely true. I think the interview, you can see when someone's been sort of heavily prepped for it. They become a little bit more robotic. They're less natural. It's not a conversation.
Yeah.
And I think schools really favour that more conversational approach, where a student can genuinely engage with the questions that are being asked and respond in a sort of energised manner that is also genuine.
So you've seen loads of kids, and I expect they're all different in their own particular ways. Are there a few bits of advice that you hear yourself giving to the majority of students that you think could be broadly helpful for today's audience?
Yeah, certainly. I think the first would be is that a lot of students get very anxious about interviews and they're very worried about them as if they're sort of a pass-fail nature. And that sort of cripples them. That sense of not being able to get questions right really affects them. I think the second point would be that they rush into answers. They don't think about the question that's being asked or what they want to say in response and how they want to say it. And I think the third element would be the kind of detail, giving that level of a developed answer. They often struggle and are a little bit more literal and monosyllabic. So the interviewer doesn't get a sense of the character of the individual or necessarily their interests, passions, or strengths.
I mean, I suppose it's quite natural to be nervous. They're quite young children. It's a pretty unusual experience compared to what they're used to at school. What tips can you tend to give for those common problems that you see?
So I think on the anxiety point, absolutely, and a little bit of anxiety is good. It keeps you on your toes. But I think when I speak to students and say to them, well, actually, you've been invited. They want to listen and to learn from you and about you, particularly with regards to your interests, your passions, your current school, the things that you enjoy. And so therefore you sort of start in the yes pile. And as a consequence, it's about the quality of your answers that either keeps you in the yes pile or perhaps moves you towards the other pile. So I think once they understand that in particular, they become a little bit less nervous and less anxious about it. And also they realise that the types of questions that are being asked often are about them. And they're the world's leading expert on themselves.
Guess it must be pretty nerve-wracking if you're trying to remember the right answer.
Yeah.
And a bit like another kind of test that you're trying to regurgitate pre-learned answers. So maybe speak to that if they're being themselves in a way that might lessen their anxiety a little bit because they're not trying to speak to a script.
Absolutely. I think you want to put your best foot forward, and you do want to talk about the different things that are important within your life and the things that you're good at. But I certainly would avoid memorising things because I worry that if it doesn't spring to mind at the time, that's when the anxiety might sort of seep in. And as a result, you might start to kind of dry up with regards to the detail of your answers.
Yeah. And what about, you said that the other very frequent problem is just giving these rather short, literal answers. How can students improve on that score?
So I think to take a little bit perhaps of their English and bring it into the interview, there's often a structure that's used within comprehension, which is PEE, point, evidence, explanation. And I think that in the normal sorts of questions that you get within an interview, such as what's your favourite subject, tell me a little bit more about your school, what do you do outside of the classroom by way of extracurricular activities, I think it's important not to just offer the point, whether that be football or rugby or English as your favourite subject, but then to back that up with evidence as to why you've said that, and then a little bit more explanation. Perhaps that you recently played a derby match against the local rival school and you won. You were really happy about it, or that at the moment in history, which happens to be your favourite subject, you're learning about the Tudors and you found particular kings interesting, or other events. So I think that structure is very useful to keep in mind because it helps to give depth and breadth to the answer that you're giving. And it's also something that students have often come across within the context of their other life.
It's not totally new to them. Yeah, absolutely get that. Do you think that when you're talking about the PEE, it's the sort of the E and the E that really win it for students, that you're never going to get marks for just saying history or just saying football. But it's when you actually give that personal anecdote where you come off the page and there's no one else that's going to give an answer similar to yours.
Absolutely. Because I think if you're asked, do you enjoy reading? And you say, yes, I do. It doesn't really tell you a lot. The interviewer doesn't really know what you enjoy reading, where you read, when you read, those sorts of things. So I think the evidence and the explanation, or just the kind of the why, which that can be kind of distilled down into, I think is really important. I think that is the differentiating factor. And I think that's what students should focus on. It's really important that that detail, that level of detail is shared.
Now, you mentioned just now, you gave us a few instances of the types of questions that are asked about history, about sport. Sometimes we have parents come to us saying that there are famously fiendish questions that are asked. Has that been your experience? How easy are the questions that are given?
I think a lot of interviews start certainly on common topics like your family, your school, the sorts of things you do in your school, whether that be academic or extracurricular. And then they'll move on to perhaps broader topics like your ambitions, the things you might like to do, potentially also asking you to be a little bit more reflective on your life to date. So what have been your biggest achievements? How might your best friends describe you? So a lot of these things are well within the grasp of a student being interviewed. These are things that they know. These are questions that when asked, they'll have an answer to. I think the broader questions are asked, but often they're in response to a picture or perhaps a topic that's brought up in interviews such as news, where a moral or ethical or just general question might be asked.
And are there, I know there are no right answers, but are there more correct answers for those difficult questions than for the slightly more common ground questions?
I think balance is a key word to keep in one's mind. So when you are giving a response to that sort of question, it's important to consider potentially both sides of the question. So if it was a moral question, do you agree with something? You might offer your opinion, but it'd be great also if you could see the other side. And I think even 10 and 7 and 8 year olds are very capable of doing that, as would be students older, sort of through the ages.
Ed, I'm very excited to say that we've had our first live question from Arantxa. How much does the admissions team look at the date of birth of the child for interviews or tests when deciding to offer a place? So like late summer birthdays versus September. I imagine if the interview comes in January, it's going to advantage those born before January than after January of the year?
Yeah, I certainly think they'll be aware of it. And as you know, more admissions processes are date of birth led.
Yeah.
So the assessment point can be varied depending on your date of birth. So I do think they'll be mindful of it, but in terms of when the offer is given, I'm not 100% sure that would necessarily come into it. I think they would be looking more at the results, which obviously could be informed by the date of birth, and maybe the maturity within the context of the interview. Yeah. So I think it's something that they will be mindful of, but I don't think it would be necessarily a definitive factor on its own.
As you've been talking, I've been thinking, what are these schools actually looking for when they're asking about your ambitions or what your greatest achievements are? What would mark out a really stellar answer versus one which just leaves them a bit flat?
It's a really good question. I think that they focus on two things. I think it's the way in which the student answers the question often. Not necessarily what they say, but just if they give a reason and provide good evidence to back that up. Yeah. I think that's often a good indicator of how articulate, intelligent somebody might be and the kind of learner they might be in the classroom, which of course is a part of why we're interviewing students. I think the other part of it, of course, is that there is a content element, clearly. And I think if somebody went off on a complete tangent, I think the interviewer might be wary of that, and as a consequence they might have be starting to sort of question how well they've sort of comprehended the question asked.
I've heard schools use the word teachability, that often they can see from an interview just how teachable someone is, which obviously bodes very well for their future schooling. Great. Might just draw this to a close by asking what parents can do to support their children with this particular part of the admissions process. Should they be doing lots of practice interviews themselves, do you think? Should they be bringing in godparents and uncles and that sort of thing? What do you suggest?
I mean, I definitely think that in normal conversation, they should be encouraging their children to develop their answers to whatever question that might be. Yeah. To giving a reason, to avoid this sort of monosyllabic, one-word, literal approach. Yeah. And I think that could be anything about whether they enjoy something, if they've been to an event, they've seen something, they're being asked what they'd like for dinner. I think it would be great to encourage a developed answer at all times. Yeah. And I think that really has a knock-on effect going forward into these interviews. But I think in terms of the content that most interviews cover, I also think it's important to realise that a lot of the ground is very common. It's often about their family, it's about school and why they like it. What's the most interesting part of it for them, as well as their interests, their hobbies, the sorts of things they do on a daily basis.
Sure. So they shouldn't be too worried about one interview for St Paul's, one for Westminster, one for the boarding school, necessarily.
No, I think there are a set of core skills that transcend even the different types of interview, because we know that there are group interviews, there are one-on-ones, there are often group interviews and one-on-ones in some schools. Yeah. So I think those core skills are intrinsic to both. And I think particularly in terms of answer structure and developing one's answer, you'd want the answer to be equally as developed in a group environment as you would within a one-to-one. So I think there are clearly schools which ask for and require students to talk about specific things with interviews. It's quite common now for students to have to bring some work with them, to have to talk about it. And I think that should be something they're encouraged to do at home anyway. Perhaps they might be proud of an achievement recently. So I think just encouraging them to develop their answers, but also getting to talk more actively about school, the things they enjoy doing, their interests, their passions, their hobbies, I think it is all good ground. The only thing I would say that's slightly different if you're a little bit older is starting to think about, particularly for 16 plus, why is it that you enjoy this subject in particular? And I think that's a really important point to get across, because at that level, you have a general interview often as well as a subject-specific one, in which the interviewer is going to be trying to work out what it is that, drives you to want to study this subject.
And very often a 15, 16-year-old hasn't actually thought about why they love English or maths or physics, even if they do. I might just end with one question myself, slightly more kind of out there, but if you were a school, would you put interviews at the heart of your admissions policy? Do you think it's a good way to test 10, 11-year-olds? Or do you think it's a bit too arbitrary and a bit too kind of gaffe prone that someone might not reveal their true selves?
I think it's a lot less arbitrary than sort of written assessments or computerized assessments. I think it gives you a real sense of the individual that you've got in front of you. And I think importantly, interviews are often carried out by teaching staff. And it won't be long before they work out whether this is the kind of individual they'd like in their classroom. And therefore, I think they give a great platform for students to excel, whether they are confident, shy, sort of exuberant characters, or quite the opposite. I think an interview allows every individual to sort of communicate their interests, their passions, their strengths in an environment which potentially is a little bit less sort of cut and dry. In an interview, if you don't get if the first question doesn't go so well, you've got plenty more to go. And I think the key is that schools have interviewers that work hard, although I appreciate they have a lot of interviews to do.
Well, Ed, thank you so much. Thank you very much to the viewers for logging in. Any questions that you've got, as I say, put them in the comments. We'll be tracking the talk over the next few weeks and be delighted to help in any way we can. Thanks very much.